Since you mentioned the Long March and the unlikely coming to power of the Communist Party, let's go back. We began comparing Xi Jinping and Mao. Let's go back to Mao. How did Mao come to power?
The road to Mao coming to power, we need to first say that China was under rule by emperors until 1911, overthrown by an upheaval that was partly by people who wanted to change China into a republic, but also some people who wanted to get rid of the last dynasty was a group of Manchu ruling families, so they saw them as like ethnic outsiders. So it was a strange combination of kind of ethnic nationalists who wanted China back under the control of Han Chinese, other people who thought the time for rule by emperors was over and wanted to establish a republic. And Sun Yat-sen became a first president, provisional president of this newly formed Republic of China. But then he got nudged out of power by a military strongman. And then there was a period where the country was really divided. Republic of China didn't have a strong government, but there were then two groups. One rallied around Sun Yat-sen, had founded something that became known as the Nationalist Party. And then there was a small group of people who formed a Communist Party. Mao was one of them. These were intellectuals who were part of the May 4th movement of 1919. They were inspired by Marxist ideas, but they were also just inspired by the Russian Revolution. Russia was nearby. It seemed good to think with. It had a largely rural population, and somehow it seemed to be getting strong in the world. And there was this interest in sort of how China could do that. And the newly formed Soviet Union did something very important. There were a group of foreign powers, including Tsarist Russia, that had gained big concessions out of China when, in 1900, the Boxer Uprising had taken place and then been crushed by a consortium of foreign powers who had gotten privileges and indemnities out of that. And the newly formed Soviet Union renounced those, said, that was the old order, that was imperialism. And so Marx's ideas were attractive to some Chinese thinkers, but Lenin was very attractive because of his combination of anti-imperialism and his notion of a vanguard party leading a country forward. So there was a small communist party, a bigger nationalist party. They were involved in these protests against warlords and against imperialists. And while Sun Yat-sen was alive, Sun Yat-sen got the two parties to work together because Sun Yat-sen wasn't a Marxist. He didn't believe in class struggle, but he admired Lenin and Leninism. And so he said that actually the Communist Party and the Nationalist Party may have had different views of the path forward for China, but they agreed on who the enemies were. And the enemies were the warlords who were keeping China weak and too willing to compromise with Japan, and foreign imperialism. So China needed to get rid of the warlords and become a stronger country, and then they could sort it out of what road to take. Sun Yat-sen dies in 1925, and his successor, Chiang Kai-shek, keeps the alliance going with the Communist Party, but in 1927, he turns against the communists and tries to carry out a purge against the Communist Party members.
He's the head of the Nationalists.
He's the head of the Nationalists. And he has some very different, he's a kind of culturally more conservative figure. But what's important in part about this is there are some members of the Chinese Communist Party who accept the basic ideas of Marxism, of revolution comes from the cities. But Mao has this idea that actually he loves this idea of peasant rebellions in China's past as driving history forward. And he starts writing about how, well, maybe in China's case, actually the peasantry, farmers can be a radical force. And so the Communist Party is on the run. It's being pushed around, but the nationalists are trying to exterminate them. But eventually, the nationalists and the communists ally again, after Japan invades China in the 1930s, they form what's called a Second United Front. But during this period, Mao is emerging as taking leadership in the Chinese Communist Party, and his idea of a different kind of vision of communist revolution that has the revolutionary vanguard somehow being the peasantry. After World War II, after the two parties have brokered a truce and sort of worked together against Japan, there's a civil war between the nationalists and the communists. And against all odds, the Communist Party wins. The Communist Party gets support from the Soviet Union. The nationalists get support from the United States, even though neither of them are quite doing things the way that their backer would like them to. But there also is a way in which and this is something I think the Communist Party leaders remember, there's a feeling that the Nationalist Party doesn't really believe its own rhetoric, that in fact all it cares about is having power and that it's internally corrupt. Chiang Kai-shek himself isn't viewed as sort of personally corrupt, but family members, and there's an idea that there's just a small band of people that are benefiting, and there's a kind of disgust with the leader, with the nationalists. The nationalists end up in retreat in Taiwan. That's why Taiwan then becomes the Republic of China. There's an uprising there that Chiang Kai-shek's people, the nationalists, repress. And there starts being, from the late 1940s on, this long period of martial law on Taiwan. And there becomes then this period where the mainland's under the control of a Leninist party, believes in one-party rule, and believes that it was a very bad period in Chinese history when China was unable to stand up to imperialists. Taiwan's controlled by a Leninist party that believes in one-party rule, limits on participation, believes that it was a bad time when China was being bullied by imperialists. What distinguishes Chiang Kai-shek has a personality cult, Mao has a personality cult. They have a lot in common, but one clear thing that makes them different is Chiang Kai-shek says that what's wrong with the Communist Party is they've abandoned Chinese traditional values of Confucianism. And Mao says that on the nationalists, what's really bad is they are still wedded to these traditional Chinese values of Confucianism. So cycling back to where we began
Yeah.
with Mao and Xi, you could actually say Xi Jinping in some ways is like living out the dream that Chiang Kai-shek had
Mhm.
of one-party rule and also kind of celebrating Confucianism.
Yeah, there's elements. You've spoken about the elements of Chiang Kai-shek and Mao that Xi Jinping kind of combines. You've also mentioned an interesting, if we had, $100 to talk about, there's another interesting side effect similarity that you talk about where Xi Jinping's wife is out there, a known entity, a part of his public image, and same was the case with Chiang Kai-shek.
Yes, and both of them, right, they had high-profile wives who were sort of celebrity figures and made a good impression globally and were more like kind of first ladies. But both Chiang Kai-shek and Xi Jinping oversaw a period of emphasizing more traditional patriarchal values
Mm-hmm.
in China. And one of the things I didn't mention before, Xi Jinping has been very in this idea of trying to do away with difference within PRC. He's been pushing against any kinds of feminist movements.
So going back to Confucius.
Yeah. Yeah, in some ways. I mean, there are people who will argue for a less patriarchal Confucianism, but it fits with that mode.